Thank you for downloading this audio title, published by thoughtaudio.com.
The Loss of the SS Titanic by Lawrence Beesley, scholar of Gonville and Caius College, and one of the survivors.
Narrated by Michael Scott. Produced by thoughtaudio.com.
I had been fortunate enough to secure a two-berth cabin to myself, D56, quite close to the saloon, and most convenient in every way for getting about the ship. And on a big ship like the Titanic, it was quite a consideration to be on D-deck, only 3 decks below the top or boat deck. Below D again were cabins on E and F decks, and to walk down from a cabin on F up to the top deck, climbing 5 flights of stairs on the way, was certainly a considerable task for those not able to take much exercise. The Titanic management has been criticized, among other things, for supplying the boat with lifts. It has been said they were an expensive luxury, and the room they took up might have been utilized in some way for more life-saving appliances. Whatever else may have been superfluous, lifts certainly were not. Old ladies, for example, in cabins on F deck, would hardly have got to the top deck during the whole voyage had they not been able to ring for the lift boy. Perhaps nothing gave one greater impression of the size of the ship than to take the lift from the top and drop slowly down past the different floors, discharging and taking in passengers just as in a large hotel. I wonder where the lift boy was that night. I would have been glad to find him in our boat, or in the Carpathia when we took count of the saved. He was quite young, not more than 16, I think, a bright-eyed, handsome boy with a love for the sea and the games on deck and the view over the ocean, and he did not get any of them. One day, as he put me out of the lift and saw through the vestibule windows, a game of deck quoits in progress, he said, in a wistful tone, "My, I wish I could go out there sometimes." I wished he could too, and made a jesting offer to take charge of his lift for an hour while he went out to watch the game. But he smilingly shook his head and dropped down in answer to an imperative ring from below. I think he was not on duty with his lift after the collision, but if he were, he would smile at his passengers all the time as he took them up to the boats waiting to leave the sinking ship. After undressing and climbing into the top berth, I read from about 11:15 to the time we struck, about 11:45. During this time, I noticed particularly the increased vibration of the ship, and I assumed that we were going at higher speed than at any other time since we sailed from Queenstown. Now, I am aware that this is an important point, and bears strongly on the question of responsibility for the effects of the collision. But the impression of increased vibration is fixed in my memory so strongly that it seems important to record it. 2 things led me to this conclusion. First, that as I sat on the sofa undressing, with bare feet on the floor, the jar of the vibration came up from the engines below very noticeably. And second, that as I sat up in the berth reading, the spring mattress supporting me was vibrating more rapidly than usual. This cradle-like motion was always noticeable as 2 things led me to this conclusion. First, that as I sat on the sofa undressing, with bare feet on the floor, the jar of the vibration came up from the engines below very noticeably. And second, that as I sat up in the berth reading, the spring mattress supporting me was vibrating more rapidly than usual. This cradle-like motion was always noticeable as one lay in bed. But that night, there was certainly a marked increase in the motion. The vibration must have come almost directly up from above, when it is mentioned that the saloon was immediately above the engines, and my cabin next to the saloon. From these 2 data, on the assumption that greater vibration is an indication of higher speed, and I suppose it must be, then I am sure we were going faster that night at the time we struck the iceberg than we had done before. That is, during the hours I was awake and able to take note of anything. And then, as I read in the quietness of the night, broken only by the muffled sound that came to me through the ventilators of stewards talking and moving along the corridors, when nearly all the passengers were in their cabins, some asleep in bed, others undressing, and others only just down from the smoking room and still discussing many things, there came what seemed to me nothing more than an extra heave of the engines, and a more than usually obvious dancing motion of the mattress on which I sat. Nothing more than that. No sound of a crash or of anything else. No sense of shock. No jar that felt like one heavy body meeting another. And presently, the same thing repeated with about the same intensity. The thought came to me that they must have still further increased the speed. And all this time, the Titanic was being cut open by the iceberg and water was pouring in her side. And yet, no evidence that would indicate such a disaster had been presented to us. It fills me with astonishment now to think of it. Consider the question of list alone. Here was this enormous vessel running starboard side onto an iceberg, and a passenger sitting quietly in bed, reading, felt no motion or list to the opposite or port side. And this must have been felt had it been more than the usual roll of the ship, never very much in the calm weather we had all the way. Again, my bunk was fixed to the wall on the starboard side, and any list to port would have tended to fling me out on the floor. I am sure I should have noted it, had there been any. And yet the explanation is simple enough. The Titanic struck the berg with a force of impact of over 1,000,000 foot-tons. Her plates were less than an inch thick, and they must have been cut through as a knife cuts paper. There would be no need to list. It would have been better if she had listed and thrown us out on the floor, for it would have been an indication that our plates were strong enough to offer, at any rate, some resistance to the blow, and we might all have been safe today. And so, with no thought of anything serious having happened to the ship, I continued my reading. And still the murmur from the stewards and from the adjoining cabins, and no other sound, no cry in the night, no alarm given, no one afraid. There was then nothing which could cause fear to the most timid person. But in a few moments I felt the engines slow and stop. The dancing motion and the vibration ticking clock stopped suddenly in a quiet room, and then have noticed the clock and the ticking noise, of which we seemed until then quite unconscious. So in the same way, the fact was suddenly brought home to all in the ship that the engines, that part of the ship that drove us through the sea, had stopped dead. But the stopping of the engines gave us no information. We had to make our calculations as to why we had stopped. Like a flash it came to me. We have dropped a propeller blade. When this happens, the engines always race away until they are controlled, and this accounts for the extra heave they gave. Not a very logical conclusion when considered now, for the engines should have continued to heave all the time until we stopped. But it was at the time a sufficiently tenable hypothesis to hold. Acting on it, I jumped out of bed, slipped on a dressing gown over pajamas, put on shoes, and went out of my cabin into the hall near the saloon. Here was a steward leaning against the staircase, probably waiting until those in the smoke-room above had gone to bed, and he would put out the lights. I said, "Why have we stopped?" "I don't know, sir," he replied, "but I don't suppose it is anything much." "Well," I said, "I am going on deck to see what it is," and started toward the stairs. He smiled indulgently at me as I passed him and said, "All right, sir, but it is mighty cold up there." I am sure at the time he thought I was rather foolish to go up with so little reason, and I must confess I felt rather absurd for not remaining in the cabin. It seemed like making a needless fuss to walk about the ship in a dressing gown. But it was my first trip across the sea. I had enjoyed every minute of it, and was keenly alive to note every new experience, and certainly to stop in the middle of the sea with a propeller dropped seemed sufficient reason for going on deck. And yet the steward, with his fatherly smile, and the fact that no one else was about the passages or going upstairs to reconnoiter, made me feel guilty in an undefined way of breaking some code of a ship's regimen, an Englishman's fear of being thought unusual, perhaps. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs, opened the vestibule door leading to the top deck, and stepped out into an atmosphere that cut me, clad as I was, like a knife. Walking to the starboard side, I peered over and saw the sea many feet below, calm and black. Forward, the deserted deck stretching away to the first-class quarters and the captain's bridge, and behind, the steerage quarters and the stern bridge, nothing more. No iceberg on either side or astern, as far as we could see in the darkness. There were 2 or 3 men on deck, and with one, the Scotch engineer who played hymns in the saloon, I compared notes of our experiences. He had just begun to undress when the engine stopped and had come up at once, so that he was fairly well clad. None of us could see anything, and all being quiet and still, the Scotchman and I went down to the next deck. Through the windows of the smoking room, we saw a game of cards going on with several onlookers, and went in to inquire if they knew more than we did. They had apparently felt rather more of the heaving motion, but so far as I remember, none of them had gone on deck to make any inquiries, even when one of them had seen through the windows an iceberg go by, towering above the decks, and they all watched it disappear, but had then at once resumed the game. We asked them the height of the berg, and some said 100 feet, others 60 feet. One of the onlookers, a motor engineer traveling to America with a model carburetor, said, "Well, I am accustomed to estimating distances, and I put it at between 80 and 90 feet. We accepted his estimate and made guesses as to what had happened to the Titanic. The general impression was that we had just scraped the iceberg with a glancing blow on the starboard side, and they had stopped as a wise precaution to examine her thoroughly all over. I expect the iceberg has scratched off some of her new paint," said one, "and the captain doesn't like to go on until she is painted up again." We laughed at his estimate of the captain's care for the ship. Poor Captain Smith. He knew by this time only too well what had happened. One of the players, pointing to his glass of whiskey standing at his elbow and turning to an onlooker, said, "Just run along the deck and see if any ice has come aboard. I would like some for this." Amid the general laughter at what we thought was his imagination, only too realistic, alas, for when he spoke, the forward deck was covered with ice that had tumbled over, and seeing that no more information was forthcoming, I left the smoking room and went down to my cabin, where I sat for some time reading again. I am filled with sorrow to think I never saw any of the occupants of that smoking room again. Nearly all young men, full of hope for their prospects in a new world, mostly unmarried, keen, alert, with the makings of good citizens. Presently, hearing people walking about the corridors, I looked out and saw several standing in the hall talking to a steward, most of them ladies in dressing gowns. Other people were going upstairs, and I decided to go on the deck again. But as it was too cold to do so in a dressing gown, I dressed in a Norfolk jacket and trousers and walked up. There were now more people looking over the side and walking about, questioning each other as to why we had stopped, but without obtaining any definite information. I stayed on deck some minutes, walking about vigorously to keep warm, and occasionally looking downwards to the sea, as if something there would indicate the reason for delay. The ship had now resumed her course, moving very slowly through the water with a little white line of foam on each side. I think we were all glad to see this. It seemed better than standing still. I soon decided to go down again, and as I crossed from the starboard to the port side to go down by the vestibule door, I saw an officer climb on the last lifeboat on the port side, number 16, and begin to throw off the cover. But I do not remember that anyone paid any particular attention to him. Certainly, no one thought they were preparing to man the lifeboats and embark from the ship. All this time, there was no apprehension of any danger in the minds of passengers, and no one was in any condition of panic or hysteria. After all, it would have been strange if they had been, without any definite evidence of danger. As I passed to the door to go down, I looked forward again and saw to my surprise an undoubted tilt downwards from the stern to the bows. Only a slight slope, which I don't think anyone had noticed. At any rate, they had not remarked on it. As I went downstairs, a confirmation of this tilting forward came in something unusual about the stairs. A curious sense. Naturally, being tilted forward, the stairs would slope downwards at an angle and tend to throw one forward. I could not see any visible slope of the stairway. It was perceptible only by the sense of balance at this time. On D-deck were 3 ladies. I think they were all saved. And it's a good thing at least to be able to chronicle meeting someone who was saved after so much record of those who were not. Standing in the passage near the cabin. "Oh, why have we stopped?" they said. "We did stop," I replied, "but we are now going on again." "Oh no," one replied, "I cannot feel the engines as I usually do, or hear them. Listen." We listened, and there was no throb audible. Having noticed that the vibration of the engines is most noticeable lying in a bath, where the throb comes straight from the floor through its metal sides, too much so ordinarily, for one to put one's head back with comfort on the bath, I took them along the corridor to a bathroom and made them put their hands on the side of the bath. They were much reassured to feel the engines throbbing down below and to know we were making some headway. I left them, and on the way to my cabin, passed some stewards standing unconcernedly against the walls of the saloon. One of them, the library steward again, was leaning over a table writing. It is no exaggeration to say that they had neither any knowledge of the accident nor any feeling of alarm that we had stopped and had not yet gone on again full speed. Their whole attitude expressed perfect confidence in the ship and officers. Turning into my gangway, my cabin being the first in the gangway, I saw a man standing at the other end of it fastening his tie. "Anything fresh?" he said. "Not much," I replied. "We are going ahead slowly, and she is down a little at the bows. But I don't think it is anything serious. Come in and look at this man," he laughed. "He won't get up." I looked in, and in the top bunk lay a man with his back to me, closely wrapped in his bedclothes, and only the back of his head visible. "Why won't he get up? Is he asleep?" I said. "No," laughed the man dressing. "He says," but before he could finish the sentence, the man above grunted, "You don't catch me leaving a warm bed to go up on the cold deck at midnight. I know better than that." We both told him laughingly why he had better get up, but he was certain he was just as safe there, and all this dressing was quite unnecessary. So I left them and went again to my cabin. I put on some underclothing, sat on the sofa, and read for some 10 minutes, when I heard through the open door above the noise of people passing up and down, and a loud shout from above, "All passengers on deck with lifebelts on." I placed the 2 books I was reading in the side pockets of my Norfolk jacket, picked up my lifebelt. Curiously enough, I had taken it down for the first time that night from the wardrobe when I first retired to my cabin, and my dressing gown, and walked upstairs tying on the lifebelt. As I came out of my cabin, I remember seeing the purser's assistant, with his foot on the stairs about to climb them, whisper to a steward and jerk his head significantly behind him. Not that I thought anything of it at the time, but I have no doubt he was telling him what had happened up in the bows, and was giving him orders to call all passengers. Going upstairs with other passengers, no one ran a step or seemed alarmed. We met 2 ladies coming down. One seized me by the arm and said, "Oh, I have no lifebelt. Will you come down to my cabin and help me find it?" I returned with them to F deck, the lady who had addressed my amusement, and we found a steward in her gangway who took them in and found their life belts. Coming upstairs again, I passed the purser's window on F deck and noticed a light inside. When halfway up to E deck, I heard the heavy metallic clang of the safe door, followed by a hasty step retreating along the corridor towards the first-class quarters. I have little doubt it was the purser who had taken all valuables from his safe and was transferring them to the charge of the first-class purser in the hope that they might all be saved in one package. That is why I said above that perhaps the envelope containing my money was not in the safe at the bottom of the sea. It is probably in a bundle with many others like it, waterlogged at the bottom. Reaching the top deck, we found many people assembled there, some fully dressed with coats and wraps, well prepared for anything that might happen. Others who had thrown wraps hastily round them when they were called or heard the summons to equip themselves with life belts, not in much condition to face the cold of that night. Fortunately, there was no wind to beat the cold air through our clothing. Even the breeze caused by the ship's motion had died entirely away, for the engines had stopped again, and the Titanic lay peacefully on the surface of the sea, motionless, quiet, not even rocking to the roll of the sea. Indeed, as we were to discover presently, the sea was as calm as an inland lake, save for the gentle swell, which could impart no motion to a ship the size of the Titanic. To stand on the deck many feet above the water, lapping idly against her sides, and looking much farther off than it really was, because of the darkness, gave one a sense of wonderful security. To feel her so steady and still was like standing on a large rock in the middle of the ocean. But there was now more evidence of the coming catastrophe to the observer than had been apparent when on deck last. One was the roar and hiss of escaping steam from the boilers, issuing out of a large steam pipe reaching high up one of the funnels, a harsh, deafening boom that made conversation difficult and no doubt increased the apprehension of some people merely because of the volume of noise. If one imagines 20 locomotives blowing off steam in a low key, it would give some idea of the unpleasant sound that met us as we climbed out on the top deck. But after all, it was the kind of phenomenon we ought to expect. Engines blow off steam when standing in a station, and why should not a ship's boilers do the same when the ship is not moving? I never heard anyone connect this noise with the danger of boiler explosion. In the event of the ship sinking with her boilers under a high pressure of steam, which was no doubt the true explanation of this precaution. But this is perhaps speculation. Some people may have known it quite well, for from the time we came on deck until boat 13 got away, I heard very little conversation of any kind among the passengers. It is not the slightest exaggeration to say that no signs of alarm were exhibited by anyone. There was no indication of panic or hysteria, no cries of fear, and no running to and fro to discover what was the matter, why we had been summoned on deck with life belts, and what was to be done with us now that we were there. We stood there quietly looking on at the work of the crew as they manned the lifeboats, and no one ventured to interfere with them or offered to help them. It was plain we should be of no use, and the crowd of men and women stood quietly on the deck, our pace slowly up and down, on the deck, our pace slowly up and down, waiting for orders from the officers. Now, before we consider any further the events that followed, the state of mind of passengers at this juncture, and the motives which led each one to act as he or she did in the circumstances, it is important to keep in thought the amount of information at our disposal. Men and women act according to judgment based on knowledge of the conditions around them, and the best way to understand some apparently inconceivable things that happened is for anyone to imagine himself or herself standing on deck that night. It seems a mystery to some people that women refused to leave the ship, that some persons retired to their cabins, and so on. But it is a matter of judgment after all, so that if the reader will come and stand with the crowd on deck, he must first rid himself entirely of the knowledge that the Titanic had sunk, an important necessity, for he cannot see conditions as they existed there through the mental haze arising from knowledge of the greatest maritime tragedy the world has known. He must get rid of any foreknowledge of disaster to appreciate why people acted as they did. Secondly, he had better get rid of any picture in thought painted either by his own imagination or by some artist, whether pictorial or verbal, from information supplied. Some are most inaccurate, these mostly word pictures, and where they err on the highly dramatic side. They need not have done so. The whole conditions were dramatic enough in all their bare simplicity, without the addition of any high coloring. Having made these mental erasures, he will find himself as one of the crowd faced with the following conditions: a perfectly still atmosphere, a beautifully brilliant starlight night, but no moon, and so with little light that was of any use. A ship that had come quietly to rest without any indication of disaster, no iceberg visible, no hole in the ship's side through which water was pouring in, nothing broken or out of place, no sound of alarm, no panic, no movement of anyone except at a walking pace, the absence of any knowledge of the nature of the accident, of the extent of damage, of the danger of the ship sinking in a few hours, of the number of boats, rafts, and other life-saving appliances available, their capacity, what other ships were near or coming to help. In fact, an almost complete absence of any positive knowledge on any point. I think this was the result of deliberate judgment on the part of the officers, and perhaps it was the best thing that could be done. In particular, he must remember that the ship was 1/6 of a mile long, with passengers on 3 decks open to the sea, and port and starboard sides to each deck. He will then get some idea of the difficulty presented to the officers of keeping control over such a large area, and the impossibility of anyone knowing what was happening except in his own immediate vicinity. Perhaps the whole thing can be summed up best by saying that, after we had embarked in the lifeboats and rowed away from the Titanic, it would not have surprised us to hear that all passengers would be saved. The cries of drowning people after the Titanic gave the final plunge were a thunderbolt to us. I am aware that the experience of many of those saved differed in some respects from the above. Some had knowledge of certain things. Some were experienced travelers and sailors, and therefore deduced more rapidly what was likely to happen. But I think the above gives a... I remember at that moment thinking it would be well to return to my cabin and rescue some money and warmer clothing if we were to embark in boats. But looking through the vestibule windows and seeing people still coming upstairs, I decided it would only cause confusion passing them on the stairs, and so remained on deck. I was now on the starboard side of the top boat deck, the time about 12:20. We watched the crew at work on the lifeboats, number 9, 11, 13, 15, some inside arranging the oars, some coiling ropes on the deck, the ropes which ran through the pulleys to lower to the sea, others with cranks fitted to the rocking arms of the davits. As we watched, the cranks were turned. The davits swung outwards until the boats hung clear of the edge of the deck. Just then, an officer came along from the first-class deck and shouted above the noise of escaping steam, "All women and children get down to deck below, and all men stand back from the boats." He had apparently been off duty when the ship struck and was lightly dressed, with a white muffler twisted hastily round his neck. The men fell back, and the women retired below to get into the boats from the next deck. 2 women refused at first to leave their husbands, but partly by persuasion and partly by force, they were separated from them and sent down to the next deck. I think that by this time, the work on the lifeboats and the separation of men and women impressed on us slowly the presence of imminent danger. But it made no difference in the attitude of the crowd. They were just as prepared to obey orders and to do what came next as when they first came on deck. I do not mean that they actually reasoned it out. They were the average Teutonic crowd, with an inborn respect for law and order, and for traditions bequeathed to them by generations of ancestors. The reasons that made them act as they did were impersonal, instinctive, hereditary. But if there were anyone who had not by now realized that the ship was in danger, all doubt on this point was to be set at rest in a dramatic manner. Suddenly, a rush of light from the forward deck, a hissing roar that made us all turn from watching the boats, and a rocket leapt upwards to where the stars blinked and twinkled above us. Up it went, higher and higher, with a sea of faces upturned to watch it, and then an explosion that seemed to split the silent night in two, and a shower of stars sank slowly down and went out one by one. And with a gasping sigh, one word escaped the lips of the crowd: rockets. Anybody knows what rockets at sea mean. And presently another, and then a third. It is no use denying the dramatic intensity of the scene. Separate it if you can from all the terrible events that followed, and picture the calmness of the night, the sudden light on the decks crowded with people in different stages of dress and undress, the background of huge funnels and tapering masts refueled by the soaring rocket, whose flash illumined at the same time the faces and minds of the obedient crowd, the one with mere physical light, the other with a sudden revelation of what its message was. Everyone knew, without being told, that we were calling for help from anyone who was near enough to see. The crew was now in the boats. The sailors, standing by the pulley ropes, let them slip through the cleats in jerks, and down the boats went to level with B-deck. Women and children climbed over the rail into the boats and filled them. One fool, all this we could see by peering over the edge of the boat deck, which was now quite open to the sea. The four boats which formed a natural barrier being lowered from the deck and leaving it exposed. About this time, while walking the deck, I saw two ladies come over from the port side and walk towards the rail separating the second class from the first class deck. There stood an officer barring the way. "May we pass to the boats?" they said. "No, ma'am," he replied softly. "Your boats are down on your own deck," pointing to where they swung below. The ladies turned and went towards the stairway, and no doubt were able to enter one of the boats. They had ample time. I mention this to show that there was, at any rate, some arrangement, whether official or not, for separating the classes in embarking in boats. How far it was carried out, I do not know, but if the second-class ladies were not expected to enter a boat from the first-class deck, while steerage passengers were allowed access to the second-class deck, it would seem to press rather hardly on the second-class men, and this is rather supported by the low percentage saved. Almost immediately after this incident, a report went round among men on the top deck, the starboard side, that men were to be taken off on the port side. How it originated I am quite unable to say, but can only suppose that as the port boats, numbers 10 to 16, were not lowered from the top deck quite as soon as the starboard boats, they could still be seen on deck. It might be assumed that women were being taken off on one side and men on the other, but in whatever way the report started, it was acted on at once by almost all the men, who crowded across the port side and watched the preparation for lowering the boats, leaving the starboard side almost deserted. 2 or 3 men remained, however, not for any reason that we were consciously aware of. I can personally think of no decision arising from reasoned thought that induced me to remain rather than to cross over. But while there was no process of conscious reason at work, I am convinced that what was my salvation was a recognition of the necessity of being quiet and waiting in patience for some opportunity of safety to present itself. Soon after the men had left the starboard side, I saw a bandsman, the cellist, come round the vestibule corner from the staircase entrance and run down the now deserted starboard deck, his cello trailing behind him, the spike dragging along the floor. This must have been about 12:40 a.m. I suppose the band must have begun to play soon after this and gone on until after 2 a.m. Many brave things were done that night, but none more brave than those few men playing minuet after minuet as the ship settled quietly lower and lower in the sea, and the sea rose higher and higher to where they stood. The music they played, serving alike as their own immortal requiem and their right to be recorded on the rolls of undying fame. Looking forward and downward, we could see several of the boats now in the water, moving slowly one by one from the side, without confusion or noise, and stealing away in the darkness which swallowed them in turn, as the crew bent to the oars. An officer, I think First Officer Murdoch, came striding along the deck, clad in a long coat. From his manner and face, evidently in great agitation, but determined and resolute. He looked over the side and shouted to the boats being lowered, "Lower away, and when afloat, row round to the gangway and wait for orders." "Aye, aye, sir," was the reply. And the officer passed by and went across the ship to the port side, was the reply. And the officer passed by and went across the ship to the port side. Almost immediately after this, I heard a cry from below of, "Any more ladies?" And looking over the edge of the deck, saw boat 13 swinging level with the rail of B deck, with the crew, some stokers, a few men passengers, and the rest ladies, the latter being about half the total number. The boat was almost full and just about to be lowered. The call for ladies was repeated twice again, but apparently there were none to be found. Just then one of the crew looked up and saw me looking over. "Any ladies on your deck?" he said. "No," I replied. "Then you better jump in." I sat on the edge of the deck with my feet over, threw the dressing gown, which I'd carried on my arm all of the time, into the boat, dropped, and fell in the boat near the stern. As I picked myself up, I heard a shout, "Wait a moment, here are 2 more ladies," and they were pushed hurriedly over the side and tumbled into the boat, one into the middle and one next to me in the stern. They told me afterwards that they had been assembled on a lower deck with other ladies, and had come up to B deck not by the usual stairway inside, but by one of the vertically upright iron ladders that connect each deck with the one below it, meant for the use of sailors passing about the ship. Other ladies had been in front of them and got up quickly, but these 2 were delayed a long time by the fact that one of them, the one that was helped first over the side into boat 13 near the middle, was not at all active. It seemed almost impossible for her to climb up a vertical ladder. We saw her trying to climb the swinging rope ladder up the Carpathia side a few hours later, and she had the same difficulty. As they tumbled in, the crew shouted, "Lower away." But before the order was obeyed, a man with his wife and a baby came quickly to the side. The baby was handed to the lady in the stern. The mother got in near the middle, and the father at the last moment dropped in as the boat began its journey down to the sea many feet below. Looking back now on the descent of our boat down the ship's side, it is a matter of surprise, I think, to all the occupants to remember how little they thought of it at the time. It was a great adventure, certainly. It was exciting to feel the boat sink by jerks, foot by foot, as the ropes were paid out from above and shrieked as they passed through the pulley blocks, the new ropes and gear creaking under the strain of a boat laden with people, and the crew calling to the sailors above as the boat tilted slightly, now at one end, now at the other. Lower aft, lower stern, and lower together, as she came level again. But I do not think we felt much apprehension about reaching the water safely. It certainly was thrilling to see the black hull of the ship on one side and the sea 70 feet below on the other, or to pass down by cabins and saloons brightly lighted. But we knew nothing of the apprehension felt in the minds of some of the officers, whether the boats and lowering gear would stand the strain of the weight of our 60 people. The ropes, however, were new and strong, and the boat did not buckle in the middle as an older boat might have done. Whether it was right or not to lower boats full of people to the water, and it seems likely it was not, I think there can be nothing but the highest praise given to the officers and crew above for the way in which they lowered the boats, one after the other, safely to the water. It may seem a simple matter to read about such a thing, but any sailor knows, apparently, that it is not so. An experienced officer has told me that he has seen a boat lowered in practice from a ship's deck with a trained crew and no passengers in the boat, calm water, with the ship lying in dock, and has seen the boat tilt over and pitch the crew headlong into the sea. Contrast these conditions with those obtaining that Monday morning at 12:45 a.m., and it is impossible not to feel that, whether the lowering crew were trained or not, whether they had or had not drilled since coming on board, they did their duty in a way that argues the greatest efficiency. I cannot help feeling the greatest gratitude to the two sailors who stood at the ropes above and lowered us to the sea. I do not suppose they were saved.
The end of Part 1. Please continue to Part 2. Published by thoughtaudio.com.
Sailors who stood at the ropes above and lowered us to the sea. I do not suppose they were saved.
The end of Part 1. Please continue to Part 2. Published by Segment 2. Published by thoughtaudio.com.
Perhaps one explanation of our feeling little sense of the unusual in leaving the Titanic in this way was that it seemed the climax to a series of extraordinary occurrences. The magnitude of the whole thing dwarfed events that in the ordinary way would seem to be full of imminent peril. It is easy to imagine it, a voyage of 4 days on a calm sea without a single unusual incident. The presumption, perhaps already mentally half realized, that we should be ashore in 48 hours and so complete a splendid voyage. And then to feel the engine stop, to be summoned on deck with little time to dress, to tie on a lifebelt, to see rockets shooting aloft and call for help, to be told to get into a lifeboat. After all these things, it did not seem much to feel the boat sinking down to the sea. It was the natural sequence of previous events, and we had learned in the last hour to take things just as they came. At the same time, if anyone should wonder what the sensation is like, it is quite easy to measure 75 feet from the windows of a tall house or a block of flats, look down to the ground, and fancy himself with some 60 other people crowded into a boat so tightly that he could not sit down or move about. And then picture the boat sinking down in a continuous series of jerks as the sailors pay out the ropes through cleats above. There are more pleasant sensations than this. How thankful we were that the sea was calm and the Titanic lay so steadily and quietly as we dropped down her side. We were spared the bumping and grinding against the side which so often accompanies the launching of boats. I do not remember that we even had to fend off our boat while we were trying to get free. As we went down, one of the crew shouted, "We are just over the condenser exhaust. We don't want to stay in that long or we shall be swamped. Feel down on the floor and be ready to pull up the pin which lets the ropes free as soon as we are aloft." I had often looked over the side and noticed a stream of water coming out of the side of the Titanic, just above the waterline. In fact, so large was the volume of water that as we plowed along and met the waves coming toward us, this stream could cause a splash that sent spray flying. We felt, as well as we could in the crowd of people, on the floor, along the sides, with no idea where the pin could be found, and none of the crew knew where it was, only of its existence somewhere, but we never found it. And all the time we got closer to the sea, and the exhaust roared nearer and nearer, until we finally floated, with the rope still holding us from above, the exhaust washing us away, and the force of the tide driving us back against the side, the latter not of much account in influencing the direction, however. Thinking over what followed, I imagined we must have touched the water with the condenser stream at our bows, and not in the middle as I thought at one time. At any rate, the resultant of these three forces was that we were carried parallel to the ship, directly under the place where Boat 15 would drop from her davits into the sea. Looking up, we saw her already coming down rapidly from B-deck. She must have filled almost immediately after ours. We shouted up, "Stop lowering 14." In an account which appeared in the newspapers of April the 19th, I have described this boat as 14, not knowing they were numbered alternately. And the crew and the passengers in the boat above, hearing us shout and seeing our from B deck, she must have filled almost immediately after ours. We shouted up, "Stop lowering 14." In an account which appeared in the newspapers of April the 19th, I have described this boat as 14, not knowing they were numbered alternately. And the crew and the passengers in the boat above, hearing us shout and seeing our position immediately below them, shouted the same to the sailors on the boat deck. But apparently they did not hear, for she dropped down foot by foot, 20 feet, 15, 10, and a stoker and I in the bows reached up and touched the bottom swinging above our heads, trying to push away our boat from under her. It seemed now as if nothing could prevent her dropping on us. But at this moment, another stoker sprang with his knife to the ropes that still held us, and I heard him shout, "1, 2," as he cut them through. The next moment, we were swung away from beneath 15, and were clear of her as she dropped into the water in the space we had just before occupied. I do not know how the bow ropes were freed, but imagine that they were cut in the same way, for we were washed clear of the Titanic at once by the force of the stream and floated away as the oars were got out. I think we all felt that that was quite the most exciting thing we had yet been through, and a great sigh of relief and gratitude went up as we swung away from the boat above our heads. But I heard no one cry aloud during the experience. Not a woman's voice was raised in fear or hysteria. I think we all learned many things that night about the boogie called fear, and how the facing of it is much less than the dread of it. The crew was made up of cooks and stewards, mostly the former, I think, their white jackets showing up in the darkness as they pulled away, two to an oar. I do not think they had any practice in rowing, for all night long their oars crossed and clashed. If our safety had depended on speed or accuracy in keeping time, it would have gone hard with us. Shouting began from one end of the boat to the other as to what we should do, where we should go, and no one seemed to have any knowledge how to act. At last we asked, "Who is in charge of this boat?" But there was no reply. We then agreed by general consent that the stoker who stood in the stern with the tiller should act as captain. And from that time he directed the course, shouting to other boats and keeping in touch with them. Not that there was anywhere to go or anything we could do. Our plan of action was simple: to keep all the boats together as far as possible and wait until we were picked up by other liners. The crew had apparently heard of the wireless communications before they left the Titanic, but I never heard them say that we were in touch with any boat but the Olympic. It was always the Olympic that was coming to our rescue. They thought they even knew her distance, and making a calculation, we came to the conclusion that we ought to be picked up by her about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But this was not our only hope of rescue. We watched all the time in the darkness for streamers' lights, thinking there might be a chance of other steamers coming near enough to see the lights which some of our boats carried. I am not sure there was no feeling in the minds of anyone that we should not be picked up the next day. We knew that wireless messages would go out from ship to ship, and as one of the stokers said, "The sea will be covered with ships tomorrow afternoon. They will race up from all over the sea to find us." Some even thought that fast torpedo boats might run up ahead of the Olympic, and yet the Olympic was, after all, the farthest. 8 other ships lay within 300 miles of us. How thankful we should have been to know how near help was, and how many ships had heard our message and were rushing to the Titanic's aid. I think nothing has surprised us more than to learn so many ships were near enough to rescue us in a few hours. Almost immediately after leaving the Titanic, we saw what we all said was a ship's light down on the horizon on the Titanic's port side. 2 lights, one above the other, and plainly not one of our boats. We even rowed in that direction for some time, but the lights drew away and disappeared below the horizon. But this is rather anticipating. We did none of these things first. We had no eyes for anything but the ship we had just left. As the oarsmen pulled slowly away, We all turned and took a long look at the mighty vessel, towering high above our midget boat. And I know it must have been the most extraordinary sight I shall ever be called upon to witness. I realize now how totally inadequate language is to convey to some other person who was not there any real impression of what we saw. But the task must be attempted. The whole picture is so intensely dramatic that, while it is not possible to place on paper for eyes to see the actual likeness of the ship as she lay there, some sketch of the scene will be possible. First of all, the climatic conditions were extraordinary. The night was one of the most beautiful I have ever seen. The sky, without a single cloud to mar the perfect brilliance of the stars, clustered so thickly together that in places there seemed almost more dazzling points of light set in the black sky than the background of sky itself. And each star seemed, in the keen atmosphere, free from any haze, to have increased its brilliance tenfold, and to twinkle and glitter with a staccato flash that made the sky seem nothing but a setting made for them in which to display their wonder. They seemed so near, and their light so much more intense than ever before, that fancy suggested they saw this beautiful ship in dire distress below, and all their energies had awakened to flash messages across the black dome of the sky to each other, telling and warning of the calamity happening in the world beneath. Later, when the Titanic had gone down, and we lay still on the sea waiting for the day to dawn or a ship to come, I remember looking up at the perfect sky and realizing why Shakespeare wrote the beautiful words he put in the mouth of Lorenzo. Jessica, look how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patines of bright gold. There's not the smallest orb which thou beholdest, but in his motion like an angel sings, still queering to the young-eyed cherubims, each harmony is in immortal souls. But while this muddy vesture of decay doth grossly close it in, we cannot hear it. But it seemed almost as if we could that night. The stars seemed really to be alive and to talk. The complete absence of haze produced a phenomenon I had never seen before. Where the sky met the sea, the line was as clear and definite as the edge of a knife, so that the water and the air never merged gradually into each other and blended to a softened, rounded horizon. But each element was so exclusively separate that where a star came low down in the sky, near the clear-cut edge of the waterline, it still lost none of its brilliance. As the earth revolved and the water edge came up and covered partially the star, as it were, it simply cut the star in two. The captain of one of the ships near us that night said the stars were so extraordinarily bright near the horizon that he was deceived into thinking that they were ship's lights. He did not remember seeing such a night before. Those who were afloat will all agree with that statement. We were often deceived into thinking they were lights of a ship. And next, the cold air. Here again was something quite new to us. There was not a breath of wind to blow cleanly round us as we stood in the boat, and because of its continued persistence to make us feel cold, it was just a keen, bitter, icy, motionless cold that came from nowhere and yet was there all the time. The stillness of it, if one can imagine cold being motionless and still, was what seemed new and strange. And these, the sky and the air, were overhead, and below was the sea. Here again, something uncommon. The surface was like a lake of oil, heaving gently up and down with a quiet motion that rocked our boat dreamingly to and fro. We did not need to keep her head to the swell. Often, I watched her lying broadside onto the tide, and with a boat loaded as we were, this would have been impossible with anything like a swell. The sea slipped away smoothly under the boat, and I think we never heard it lapping on the sides, so oily in appearance was the water. So when one of the stokers said he had been to sea for 26 years and never yet seen such a calm night, we accepted it as true without comment. Just as expressive was the remark of another, "It reminds me of a bloomin' picnic." It was quite true. It did. A picnic on a lake, or a quiet inland river like the Cobh, or a backwater on the Thames. And so in these conditions of sky and air and sea, we gazed broadside on the Titanic from a short distance. She was absolutely still. Indeed, from the first, it seemed as if the blow from the iceberg had taken all the courage out of her, and she had just come quietly to rest and was settling down without an effort to save herself, without a murmur of protest against such a foul blow. For the sea could not rock her. The wind was not there to howl noisily round the decks and make the ropes hum. From the first, what must have impressed all as they watched was the sense of stillness about her, and the slow, insensible way she sank lower and lower in the sea, like a stricken animal. The mere bulk alone of the ship, viewed from the sea below, was an awe-inspiring sight. Imagine a ship nearly a sixth of a mile long, 75 feet high to the top decks, with 4 enormous funnels above the decks, and masts again high above the funnels, with her hundreds of portholes, all her saloons and other rooms brilliant with light, and all round her little boats filled with those who until a few hours before had trod her decks and read in her libraries and listened to the music of her band in happy content, and who were now looking up in amazement the enormous mass above them and rowing away from her because she was sinking. I had often wanted to see her from some distance away, and only a few hours before, in conversation at lunch with a fellow passenger, had registered a vow to get a proper view of her lines and dimensions when we landed at New York, to stand some distance away, to take in a full view of her beautiful proportions, which the narrow approach to the dock at Southampton made impossible. Little did I think that the opportunity was to be found while against the sky was bordered all round by stars studded in the sky, and all her funnels and masts were picked out in the same way. Her bulk was seen where the stars were blotted out, and one other thing was different from expectation, the thing that ripped away from us instantly as we saw it, all sense of the beauty of the night, the beauty of the ship's lines, and the beauty of her lights. And all these things in themselves were intensely beautiful. That thing was the awful angle made by the level of the sea, with the rows of porthole lights along her side in dotted lines, row above row. The sea level and the rows of lights should have been parallel, should never have met. And now they met at an angle inside the black hull of the ship. There was nothing else to indicate she was injured. Nothing but this apparent violation of a simple geometrical law, that parallel lines should never meet, even if produced ever so far both ways. But it meant the Titanic had sunk by the head until the 2 lowest portholes in the bows were under the sea, and the portholes in the stern were lifted above the normal height. We rowed away from her in the quietness of the night, hoping and praying with all our hearts that she would sink no more, and the day would find her still in the same position as she was then. The crew, however, did not think so. It had been said frequently that the officers and crew felt assured that she would remain afloat even after they knew the extent of the damage. Some of them may have done so, and perhaps from their scientific knowledge of her construction, with more reason at the time than those who said she would sink. But at any rate, the stokers in our boat had no such illusion. One of them, I think he was the same man that cut us free from the pulley ropes, told us how he was at work in the stokehole, and in anticipation of going off duty in 1/4 of an hour, thus confirming the time of the collision at 11:45, had near him a pan of soup keeping hot in some part of the machinery. Suddenly, the whole side of the compartment caved in, and the water rushed him off his feet. Picking himself up, he sprang for the compartment doorway and was through the aperture when the watertight door came down behind him like a knife, as he said. They worked them from the bridge. He had gone up on deck, but was ordered down again at once, and with others was told to draw the fires from under the broiler, which they did, and were then at liberty to come on deck again. It seems that this particular knot of stokers must have known almost as soon as anyone of the extent of injury. He added mournfully, I could do with that hot soup now. And indeed he could. He was clad at the time of the collision, he said, in trousers and singlet, both very thin on account of the intense heat in the stokehole. And although he had added a short jacket later, his teeth were chattering with the cold. He found a place to lie down underneath the tiller on the little platform where the captain stood, and there he lay all night with a coat belonging to another stoker thrown over him, and I think he must have been almost unconscious. A lady next to him, who was warmly clad with several coats, tried to insist on his having one of hers, a fur-lined one, thrown over him, but he absolutely refused, while some of the women were insufficiently clad. And so the coat was given to an Irish girl with pretty auburn hair, standing near, leaning against the gunwale, with an outside berth, and so more exposed to the cold air. This same lady was able to distribute more of her wraps to the passengers, a rug to one. A fur lady was able to distribute more of her wraps to the passengers, a rug to one, a fur boa to another, and she has related with amusement that at the moment of climbing up the Carpathia's side, those to whom these articles had been lent offered them all back to her. But as, like the rest of us, she was encumbered with a life belt, she had to say she would receive them back at the end of the climb. I had not seen my dressing gown since I dropped into the boat, but sometime in the night, a steerage passenger found it on the floor and put it on. It is not easy at this time to call to mind who were in the boat, because in the night it was not possible to see more than a few feet away, and when dawn came, we had eyes only for the rescue ship and the icebergs. But so far as my memory serves, the list was as follows. No first-class passengers, 3 women, 1 baby, 2 men from the second cabin, and the other passengers, steerage, mostly women, a total of about 35 passengers. The rest, about 25, and possibly more, were crew and stokers. Near to me all night was a group of 3 Swedish girls, warmly clad, standing close together to keep warm, and very silent. Indeed, there was very little talking at any time. One conversation took place that is, I think, worth repeating. One more proof that the world, after all, is a small place. The 10-month-old baby, which was handed down at the last moment, was received by a lady next to me, the same who shared her wraps and coats. The mother had found a place in the middle and was too tightly packed to come through to the child, and so it slept contentedly for about an hour in a stranger's arms. It then began to cry, and the temporary nurse said, "Will you feel down and see if the baby's feet are out of the blanket? I don't know much about babies, but I think their feet must be kept warm." Wriggling down as well as I could, I found its toes exposed to the air and wrapped them well up, when it ceased crying at once. It was evidently a successful diagnosis. Having recognized the lady by her voice, it was much too dark to see faces. As one of my vis-a-vis at the purser's table, I said, "Surely, you are Miss Murdoch." "Yes," she replied, "and you must be Mr. Beesley." How curious we should find ourselves in the same boat. Remembering that she had joined the boat at Queenstown, I said, "Do you know Clonmel?" A letter from a great friend of mine who was staying there at the homestead came aboard at Queenstown. "Yes, it is my home, and I was dining at Rutherford's just before I came away." It seemed that she knew my friend too, and we all agreed that of all the places in the world to recognize mutual friends, a crowded lifeboat afloat in mid-ocean at 2 a.m., 1,200 miles from our destination, was one of the most unexpected. And all the time, as we watched, the Titanic sank lower and lower by the head, and the angle became wider and wider as the stern porthole lights lifted and the bow lights sank, and it was evident she was not to stay afloat much longer. The captain's stoker now told the oarsmen to row away as hard as they could. 2 reasons seemed to make this a wise decision. One, that as she sank, she would create such a wave of suction that boats, if not sucked under by being too near, would be in danger of being swamped by the wave her sinking would create. and we all knew our boat was in no condition to ride big waves, crowded as it was and manned with untrained oarsmen. The second was that an explosion might result from the water getting to the boilers, and a breeze might fall within a wide radius. And yet, as it turned out, neither of these things happened. At about 2:15 a.m., I think we were any distance from 1 mile to 2 miles away. It is difficult for a landsman to calculate distance at sea, but we had been afloat an hour and a half. The boat was heavily loaded, the oarsmen unskilled, and our course erratic. Following now one light and now another, sometimes a star, and sometimes a light from a port lifeboat, which had turned away from the Titanic in the opposite direction and lay almost on our horizon. And so we could not have gone very far. About this time, the water had crept up almost to her sidelight and the captain's bridge, and it seemed a question only of minutes before she sank. The oarsmen lay on their oars, and all in the lifeboat were motionless as we watched her in absolute silence, save some who would not look and buried their heads on each other's shoulders. The light still shone with the same brilliance, but not so many of them. Many were now below the surface. I have often wondered since whether they continued to light up the cabins when the portholes were under water. They may have done so. And then, as we gazed awestruck, she tilted slowly up, revolving apparently about a center of gravity just astern of amidships, until she attained a vertically upright position. And there she remained, motionless. As she swung up, her lights, which had shone without a flicker all night, went out suddenly, come on again for a single flash, then went out altogether. As they did so, there came a noise which many people, wrongly I think, have described as an explosion. It has always seemed to me that it was nothing but the engines and machinery coming loose from their bolts and bearings and falling through the compartments, smashing everything in their way. It was partly a roar, partly a groan, partly a rattle, and partly a smash, and it was not a sudden roar as an explosion would be. It went on successively for some seconds, possibly 15 to 20, as the heavy machinery dropped down to the bottom, now the bows of the ship. I suppose it fell through the end and sank first, before the ship, but it was a noise no one had ever heard before, and no one wishes to hear again. It was stupefying, stupendous, as it came to us along the water. It was as if all the heavy things one could think of had been thrown downstairs from the top of a house, smashing each other and the stairs and everything in the way. Several apparently authentic accounts have been given, in which definite stories of explosions have been related, in some cases even with wreckage blown up and the ship broken in two. But I think such accounts will not stand close analysis. In the first place, the fires had been withdrawn and the steam allowed to escape some time before she sank, and the possibility of explosion from this cause seems very remote. Then, as just related, the noise was not sudden and definite, but prolonged, more like the roll and crash of thunder. As the Titanic tilted up, they would almost certainly fall loose from their bed and plunge down through the other compartments. No phenomenon like that pictured in some American and English papers occurred, that of the ship breaking in two, and the two ends being raised above the surface, upright like a column. We could see her now only as the stern, and some 150 feet of her stood outlined against the star-specked sky, looming black in the darkness. And in this position she continued for some minutes, I think as much as 5 minutes, but it may have been less. Then, first sinking back a little at the stern, I thought, she slid slowly forwards through the water and dived slantingly down. The sea closed over her, and we had seen the last of the beautiful ship on which we embarked 4 days before at Southampton. And in the place of the ship on which all our interest had been concentrated for so long, and towards which we looked most of the time, because it was still the only object on the sea which was a fixed point to us, In place of the Titanic, we had the level sea now stretching in an unbroken expanse to the horizon, heaving gently as before, with no indication on the surface that the waves had just closed over the most wonderful vessel ever built by man's hands. The stars looked down just the same, and the air was just as bitterly cold. There seemed a great sense of loneliness when we were left on the sea in a small boat without the Titanic. Not that we were uncomfortable, except for the cold, nor in danger. We did not think we were either, but the Titanic was no longer there. We waded head-on for the wave which we thought might come, the wave we had heard so much of from the crew, and which they said had been known to travel for miles. And it never came. But although the Titanic left us no such legacy of a wave as she went to the bottom, she left us something we would willingly forget forever, something which the imagination should not dwell on: the cries of many hundreds of our fellow passengers struggling in the ice-cold water. I would willingly omit any further mention of this part of the disaster from this book, but for two reasons it is not possible. First, that as a matter of history it should be put on record, and secondly, that these cries were not only an appeal for help in the awful conditions of danger in which the drowning found themselves, an appeal that could never be answered, but an appeal to the whole world to make such conditions of danger and hopelessness impossible ever again. A cry that called to the heavens for the very injustice of its own existence, a cry that clamored for its own destruction. We were utterly surprised to hear this cry go up as the waves crossed over the Titanic. We had heard no sound of any kind from her since we left her side, and as mentioned before, we did not know how many boats she had or how many rafts. The crew may have known, but they probably did not, and if they did, they never told the passengers. We should not have been surprised to know all were safe on some life-saving device, so that, unprepared as we were for such a thing, the cries of the drowning floating across the quiet sea filled us with stupefaction. We longed to return and rescue at least some of the drowning, but we knew it was impossible. The boat was filled to standing room, and to return would mean the swamping of us all. And so the captain stoker told his crew to row away from the cries. We tried to sing to keep all from thinking of them, but there was no heart for singing in the boat at this time. The cries, which were loud and numerous at first, died away gradually, one by one. But the night was clear, frosty and still, the waters certainly much farther from the ship than we were situated. I think the last of them must have been heard nearly 40 minutes after the Titanic sank. Lifebelts would keep the survivors afloat for hours, but the cold water was what stopped the cries. They must have come to all those safe in the lifeboats, scattered round the drowning at various distances, a deep resolve that, if anything could be done by them in the future to prevent the repetition of such sounds, they would do it, at whatever cost of time or other things. And not only to them are these cries an imperative call, but to every man and woman who has known of them. It is not possible that ever again can such conditions exist, but it is a duty imperative on one and all to see that they do not. Think of it. A few more boats, a few more planks of wood nailed together in a particular way at a trifling cost, and all these men and women whom the world can so ill afford to lose would be with us today. There would be no mourning in thousands of homes which are now desolate, and these words need not have been written.
We hope you enjoyed this interesting audio title. For more information on all of our titles, please visit us at thoughtaudio.com. Interesting audio title. For more information on all of our titles, please visit us at thoughtaudio.com. Interesting audio title. For more information